Hello guys, today is 18th of September 2022. I'm trying to make this video once again. I had a few attempts at doing this and it's always kind of goes wrong. Like I said, I'm not a professional YouTuber and the software I'm using to start doing recordings now, I've been making mistakes in using it. So today we're gonna talk about the situation in Ukraine as it stands at the moment. So obviously about the offensive that's happened in Ukraine over the last couple of weeks, well, week and a half, and things that coming around it. But before I start, I'd like to say that look, as I'm not a professional YouTuber, if there's other Ukrainians who do videos in English or other languages, if I can find them, I try to show them so that people can get information by Ukrainians from Ukrainian side and from Ukrainian analytics as well. First one is a privateer station, is the channel. I've talked about it before and I always try to put them as here. Is the guys who dub the videos by analysts, mostly Alexei Arestovich, Ukrainian analyst, as a Mark Fagin, who's like a Russian journalist, slave rights protector, a lawyer. He's doing some programs and videos of him, some other analytics from other channels, but so mostly these two guys. So there's a channel by Denis Davidov. This is a Ukrainian guy, as far as I understand. He lives in Kiev and he is doing a lot of short videos. I said we can see like 14 minutes, 9 minutes, 17 minutes, so average of about like 15-minute videos. Puts a lot of work into them, does it very well, much more interesting than listening to someone like me talk. But I usually say that mine is probably the most boring videos on whole YouTube channels that exist, but nevertheless, right? And recently was looking through some Ukrainian news channels. I don't kind of check them all, but I found these guys, Hromadske. I was following them for quite a while, but for one reason or the other I had subtitles turned on, and turns out that unlike many Ukrainian channels, these guys have very good subtitles. So they're all in English and it's very good clear English. It's not auto-generated YouTube stuff where they come up with things which you can't really deal with. But these guys are very good. These are what you call new media. So these guys have started as a YouTube channel by a few journalists which were simply disagreeing with the way the information was handled by normal media, like in everyday life, and they started their own YouTube channel and became a very big thing. Right, they only have 758,000 subscribers, although I think they deserve a lot more. And if you want to look at the videos which come from Ukraine, say straight from the front lines or near front lines, and all of them, or at least most of the ones I've seen, have been very well subtitled, so you get the information directly from the sport rather than like reading some Western journalist who's writing about situation in Ukraine but doesn't even speak Ukrainian or Russian, and he's writing about it and shows his like professional opinion from somewhere in US, so like while sitting in New York or whichever. Like, so these are more direct. This is close directly to Ukraine. So yeah, this channel is an American channel. Again, these guys not claiming to be experts on things. They just cover war, and they try to use the original videos they can find online. And Funkus 530, again, not a bad analysis of the situation. I disagree with a lot of things they say because simply I get the information from the way I hear it, and because I know the language, and sometimes they go like, oh, we're not sure what they're saying there, like all the information that we got from these sources. But again, very interesting channels. They have their own website where they show the videos unedited, unscripted from Ukraine war, not just from Ukraine war, from other military conflicts, where you can find a lot of videos which would not be shown on YouTube because of the YouTube rules and regulations. So essentially those videos where there's explosions and people dying and things like this, which are, unless they're like fake ones like a movie, if it's a real people, like a real situation, YouTube does not allow to show that stuff, and obviously means that a lot of videos cannot be shown on YouTube and will be deleted. So this channel and their website is a probably good source of unedited material, which is kind of close to life that you can find. So now that we're done with that, we're gonna talk about the situation as it happened in Ukraine. So obviously everybody wants to speak about the situation near Kharkiv, but I'm gonna start talking about the situation in the south. I'm gonna start from this situation for a major reason, because it does influence everything that happens on the east. There is a very good, strong connection there. And first we're gonna understand what's happening here, so that we can move on and understand the situation that happened in the east, why it happened, not exactly why it happened, but how it became possible, right? So in the south, Ukrainians have very slow motion forward. It's kind of like few hundred meters maybe a day, to sometimes they take over like big. So for example, they say that they took over Kiselivka already, although this doesn't show on this map, which means they're about like a dozen or so kilometers from like edges of Kherson city, or at least at least away from those parts of the villages which are already considered to be part of the greater Kherson city, right? But the process here is very slow, right? And Ukrainians are being very careful in the way they move. They're obviously helped by new equipment, which allows them to take out the storage facilities that Russians have on the right side of the Dnieper River, so on the western side of the Dnieper River. Because obviously by taking them out, it means that the Russians cannot fight back as much. But here in this area, Russians brought in, before the start of Ukrainian offensive, they brought in like extra 20,000 troops to the ones they already had there, right? And those were some of the best troops, because Ukrainians were open, like, yeah, we want to take this part back at least, right? And the Russians were like, yeah, Ukrainians are gonna attack just there, and they're gonna bring over, like, they brought their best troops, because for them, losing this big chunk of territory seems like a big loss, and they were like, yeah, if we do this, we lose this part, you know, like, our people are gonna, we've been telling our people that the Ukrainians are happy to see us, you know, it's like that they're happy that we're defending them from the American Nazis and shit like this. And if we lose those territories, we're not gonna have what to tell to the Russian people, how to explain to them how is it that we apparently freed the Ukrainians and now they just want to kick us out and just shooting us out. So they brought in lots of, like, some of the best troops, let's say over 20,000, and it means that Ukrainians are struggling to just come in and do whatever they want to do, right? You know, so Ukraine's been very careful, big numbers, and because Ukrainians have managed to destroy the river crossings over the Dnieper, so there's one here which is not fully destroyed, but it's very limited crossing. The bridges down the like further down the river have been completely destroyed, so Russians have to use the like pontoon bridges, which are not very good for having mass transportation of goods and people. And this means that the Russians here, although they're struggling with the supplies, there's a video online where you can watch where the more new troops were being sent into this part of Ukraine across the river, and Ukrainian artillery has actually caught them while crossing. and they show that, look, you know, there were a few explosions, and the video shows like the people like wounded, dead, and then the guy who was actually, he dropped it because the explosion was near him, and the camera was like rolled over, and it shows him, and he was like like in full shock, like, you know, the guy's like, what's going on, right? They have lower supplies, but the problem they have here is because of these limitations of transportation across the river, they also cannot really fall back very easily. So even if Ukrainians push very, very hard, the Russians here cannot fall back because of the limitations. Essentially, if they just get their people together and say, okay, we can't hold this territory, we have to get out, or we have to move our troops from this area. Like, I have my screen in front of me, obviously, from this area, and we have to move them up east or somewhere else. Essentially, it will be like very biblical in the fact that, you know, because of such a limited places where they can cross, and those places are easily reachable by artillery. You know, the part where the river runs red with blood, like, you know, that would essentially happen there. Like tens and tens of thousands of people limited to very small areas of crossing, artillery hitting those places, they will all die. And essentially, the best thing the Russian soldiers can do in that area is like some of them are trying to get away already, because they go like, yeah, Ukrainians are coming, they're not gonna like us very much. But those who understand what's going on, and there are some very well trained troops in there, the best thing they can really do is give up. Essentially, they just wipe the white flag and say, we give up, right? We're not gonna run, you can come in, you can take us over. And this would be the best type of loss that Russian troops can take, because they already lost. We can look at the losses of Russian troops. Yeah, on the 18th, they already lost. This is the one we kind of can take matters, one the personal ones, and nearly 55,000 people, right? So we're not talking like 2.2 thousand tanks, the different machinery that transports people, like nearly 5,000, 1.3 thousand cannons, like the people, like this is anti-air defense, 300 different ones. So that all matters, but this is the number which matters the most, because it includes people, obviously losses in the tank crews and things like this. And a lot of those losses are professional Russian soldiers, but they essentially, many of these are confirmed dead. So no, we're not talking about wounded, we're not talking about maimed, right? But we will come back to this number because it matters, but these are dead. So the people who are in this area around Kherson, right, essentially they don't have anywhere to get away, and Ukrainians have to be very careful, because many of these people are fighting because they understand that they don't have any other choice, because they don't have anywhere to run. Okay, one of the Ukrainian commentators did point out one thing, is that a lot of times when the Russians move their like supplies, or they want to move their tanks by like 20, 30 kilometers, they don't actually run a tank, they prefer to put them on the trains and run them with the train. But because this part of Ukraine does not have a very large train network, they do end up having to run their tanks. So there's like a fight here, they move the tank across the river, across the crossing, and then they have to run the tank for like 20-30 kilometers, and obviously they're open in the field. So this is a very open area. If you look this area up on Google Maps, it's essentially open fields. So Ukrainians can see them from long distance, they can pick them off from long distance. The loss of the anti-air defense in that area means that there's more Ukrainian drones capable of flying above, more Ukrainian planes capable of flying above. And the fact that Ukrainians have managed to reach this area and essentially forced not just anti-air defenses to kind of work harder here, but they forced Russian airplanes to fly away from Crimea all the way to the other side of Azov Sea into Russia. Right, the strikes which were like a couple of weeks ago, right, this is what they made. And Andrei Davidov has talked about one of the channels I mentioned. He was like, yeah, you know, the gesture of goodwill of Russian planes fucking off back to Russia. Well, they've done this, but this also means that Russian planes do not have as much flight time to cover this area. So they end up having to fly all the way from Russia. Beforehand they were flying from here, like, you know, a couple of 100 kilometers, sometimes even trying to find places like for helicopters to land on this side of things. Well, that's all been taken out, so now they have to fly from all over there, and this means that they have very limited time for this area, which means that the Ukrainian aviation that, for example, can base themselves in Mykolaiv somewhere, or to, like, in Odessa, they can literally fly in, or in Kryvyi Rih, I think there is a military airport there. So there's plenty of fields that Ukrainian aviation helicopters can use to fly above this area, which makes it even harder for Russians to move their troops and equipment around here, right? Because the Russian planes cannot even compete there. And this is where the Western technology really did help Ukrainians, is to get this air superiority, even if it's not a big major one, but some, and keeping the Russians out of their hair, right? And like we said, over 20,000 troops essentially stuck in here without any chance of getting out, right? There's a very slow attempt on an offensive around here, and I mentioned this one in my previous videos. I was saying that, yep, Russians were very scared of these attacks, and they do keep a lot of troops there. And again, the fact that they having to keep their troops in here, right, without being able to move them around here, means that it's a lot of troops they have to keep here as well. Right, very slow offensive, so always under threat. If they lose this one, they lose a very large chunk of their military capability in these areas. Right, so this means that Russians cannot really afford to move their battle-ready troops to the east. And that was the key in making this happen. Okay, we talked about this in previous videos where I was saying that, look, Russians do not have the troops to hold this whole area. Even the first video I made about Ukraine, about Russian invasion in Ukraine, I said, look, they don't have the manpower, right? So long as they were aggressively attacking, they will actually kind of keep making Ukrainians defend, and Ukrainians were like, hey, you know, we don't know where the attacks are coming from, so we have to be super careful. We have to keep our troops intact. We have to make sure we can protect our people. The constant attacks against Ukrainian cities by missiles, like trying to blow things up, like what happened already here in the south, where they tried to blow up a dam just to make sure that the river rises and Ukrainians have more trouble crossing the river in Hulets. It's not a super big river, but not a super easy to cross when it rises in water, obviously. I remember swimming across the river. It was only like a couple of 100 meters, but it's not a small river. I mean, for many people, imagining the river, which is like, well, wait a minute, you have a river which is more than 100 meters wide. It's like, yep, it's something we went swimming across when we were kids, right? But obviously, if you have to move your military equipment across this river and there's no bridges, it becomes a pain in the ass. And Russians blew up the dam. Obviously, people remember them starting to make strikes against infrastructure in Kharkiv, for example, where they blew up a power station, like a local like heat and power generating station, right? But this, I think, is also due to the fact that Russians are starting to lose that technology, and the technology they have remaining is only capable of doing so much, right? So, but we're not gonna talk about technology today. All right, I will probably do a separate video where I'm gonna cover all of the technology. All right, the ones that Russians lost or will lose very soon. But what will happen now, we're gonna come back to that number, the number we talked about, the 55,000 lost in killed people, killed or captured. So these are killed or captured. These are people that Ukrainians can confirm that Russians have lost. In reality, they have lost a lot more. So we're talking about wounded people as well, but we're also talking about people who have left the military. So what happened was that because this is not officially a war in Russia, many professional soldiers, once they would be taken out of Ukraine, they'd be coming in, and like if they don't have a choice, if they haven't served enough years, they might have trouble doing this. But many soldiers that were like slightly older generation, so they started serving at 20, they have to serve for 20 years before they can get a pension, right? So this means that they like 40 years old. So these are like middle line commanding officers as well, which is very important. Right, and those guys will coming in and saying, okay, you know what, I'm either quitting because there's no way I'm going back there and I know you will send me, or I am like retiring, I'm gonna go get my minimum pension that I can, and I'm fucking off because I can obviously find jobs with my military experience in the newly found criminal gangs that are people will be appearing around Russia for in the near future. Like or I can go into some security company which is run by my mate who's like ex-military as well. So essentially a private army, but this private army is not planning on going fighting in Ukraine. Those of us who keep track of the news, I'm not gonna look this video up, but there's a video of a Russian private military organization essentially going into Russian jails and recruiting people in jail who were there for murder, for rape, for drug sales, for drugs possession. So like not the people who like kind of done some horrible shit, and they were recruiting them to go and fight in Ukraine. And the reason for this is that as well as Russian army, those private armies were sent into Ukraine as well, right? So when people say there was 150,000 Russian troops, well, it was not just Russian troops as well. There were people who were conscripted from LNR, DNR Republic, from these areas, from Luhansk and Donetsk. So people just talk about where people were just essentially picked up on the street and said, okay, you go in to fight. Many of these guys, so there's like tens of thousands of people, and there were lots of professional soldiers, mercenaries, which came from the private mercenary groups in Russia to fight in Ukraine. So the numbers were more than 150,000 overall. So they've lost over a quarter of that, about actually 50,000 plus people who left here, over a quarter, maybe 1/3 of the original people. But they're hiring a lot of people as cannon fodder from different poor, impoverished regions, or from jails, from like, for example, some people come from Moscow region, and people say, why is it people from Moscow region coming in? Well, they're coming from the region, they're not coming from the Moscow. And if Moscow leaves well, you go outside of Moscow into the region, there's plenty of little villages which are impoverished, and people come from there or from other small towns, right? And they're not properly trained, and they're being thrown into Ukraine as essentially just kind of, look, here's a gun, here's some, like, this is where you shoot, and just follow whatever this guy says, to cover the directions where the Russians think they're not gonna have as much trouble. And this is essentially what happened. Here is those troops, they had some basic training, they've been put in this direction. So we're gonna look on this map because I like the way they do the timing here. And 1st of September, if we look, all this was controlled not by professional Russian military. Some of them were there, but mostly by those conscripts. That was essentially what happened, and which made the offensive possible. But also because still like 200,000 people is really not enough, especially considering that they've been very aggressively trying to break through defenses on their line, on the front lines here. They still sometimes do. So there's like a width of like so many kilometers where they say they're still attacking, and they have been throwing people into attacks all the time, which means they don't have the properly trained people who can fight on the ground. Well, let's take a look at this one. Oh, martial arts, Google Translate. Sorry. We're gonna use Ukrainian. I'm gonna sorry. I forgot how these troops are called, but we're gonna check how. Yeah, infantry, right? They don't have properly trained infantry. Like, this is something that Ukrainians have been trying to keep intact over the start of this war, right? Because well-trained infantry, not only is it lots of money to train good infantry, but it's also your ability to do the ground operations. And if Ukrainian infantry was gaining experience, the Ukrainians have been trying to keep the infantry more intact, adding new units which have been also gaining experience, swapping units out and then filling them up with experienced, maybe some less experienced people, but overall it's like the level of Ukrainian infantry has been going up, because for like every like 10 every one Ukrainian killed, the Russians were losing 10 of their killed, and they've been constantly trying to attack and attack and attack and attack and attack on all these bases. Like I said, this was the only real way they could actually keep Ukrainians on the defensive, always trying to attack. But this meant that their experienced infantry was losing lots of people, right? Again, wounded, killed. They say about 3 wounded to every killed person. So again, we're looking at like nearly 50,000 confirmed killed or wounded, right? There's full losses, but confirmed killed and captured, sorry. Right, this means that another nearly 100,000, over 100,000, which have been wounded. Some of them, of course, could come back to fighting because they either need money, or they have not served long enough time so they can leave a contract, or they have been conscripted and then just said like, look, if you try to leave, we're gonna put you to jail because you're supposed to serve your country for so long. Or they're like from private military company, which means that if they try to run away, they were saying like, yeah, if you try to get away, we'll probably shoot you. Right, we're also talking about tens of thousands of people from Donetsk and Luhansk, which were like lost and killed. And again, all the Ukrainians saying that, hey, you know, these are the overall losses, but for example, if 20 of those 1,000 killed were people from Donetsk and Luhansk, the Russian army says, well, these are not our losses, we don't care, because they don't really care about people who live in this area. This was always just a political play for for their internal consumptions, right? But what happened was that these areas have been essentially manned by newer units, less trained units, but also from what I understand is that the way they were doing it is they have like areas where they have their main force, And then down here, these areas would not be manned as fast. So you have strongholds like Balaklia, Savinci, Chkalovsk, but the area between them, all that will be manned. There will be like some places where they will have the soldiers, but overall these defense lines were not manned very well, right? Because Ukrainians essentially managed to sneak through from behind, through between these kind of areas when they were not expecting this, and essentially start attacking and taking out the people who were holding the line, expanding the defense, and then going in depth and around Balaklia. Let's go back to this map, right? So then yeah, so coming through on these roads around Balaklia onto the roads to go in depth. They went down these roads, down these main roads. And again, something we mentioned, that in many of those areas, the only time that many people in those villages and little towns saw Russian soldiers was when the Russian soldiers were like passing through, sometimes not even ever. So there'd be like some guy come in and say, well, now you're part of Russia, there you go, like, okay, if you don't like it, we're gonna shoot you, that's it. Right, so many of these areas, as soon as Ukrainians broke through the main defense line, go back through those defense lines, because Russians do not have enough troops to hold this whole line together, they did not build a second defense line. So they used, there was some defenses, I think, along this river at some point of time, I'm not sure, but essentially once Ukrainians went through the first defense line, which was not properly manned, there was nothing there to stop their advances, and they were free to essentially go and do as they please. And within the next couple of days, essentially Russian soldiers, they were like, whoa, Ukrainians are already behind us, and they started essentially running away. So many soldiers were captured. They say over 1,000 Russian soldiers were captured between like these days and Balaklia liberated, right? See, between here and 14th, for example, where the front essentially stopped. Like now there is some fighting, it's slow fighting, but till here, like the front has stopped here, right? Over 1,000 people were captured, Russian soldiers were captured, and Ukrainians are saying, we don't have where to put them, right? And a lot of time when they were showing some interviews from some Russians, it's like, look, they just picked us up, they gave us like a week's training, and they said, you go in there, do whatever this guy tells you. And this guy is actually fucked off. Like, you know, he was the first one to take her to make a run at, right? Also, we hear the stories from, there's like a video of Arestovich where he was showing the radio conversations between the Russian troops, and they were saying that, look, some guys came here and they were supposed to be like the main battle force, and they just turned around, got on their tanks and fucked off. And while Ukrainians were attacking, you know, the troops that were bringing supplies to those frontline troops, you know, people who were not trained to do the proper fighting, they did not have the equipment, had to take the attack by Ukrainians and then ran away themselves, right? So many soldiers down there, like the troops that were there, they were essentially newly formed parts of very old, like, so they would be like, oh, these troops were there. It's like, well, actually they were not the old troops, they were newly formed parts, which essentially formed by people who got no idea about fighting. They've been just taught to how, this is how you sit on the tank, this is how you drive it. If there was somebody probably there who drove tractors or something like this, they've had a week crash course on driving the tank, and they were like, yep, we don't know who you are, we don't really care who you are, we're out from here, right? There's been plenty of videos around the YouTube as well of how Ukrainians showing that they were coming in, and they were like, oh look, there's a couple of tanks there, it's like, and then they go in like past some trees, and there's like 10-15 tanks with the supply trucks, with the people carriers, like the whole lot. There's like, you know, it's about 30 different parts of like moving equipment, like tanks, trucks, people carriers. The lot was just sitting there, and they were saying like, you know, the people who helped the Ukrainian army the most in this war, people who gave most equipment to Ukrainian army, are the Russian army, right? Not the West. All the West West supplies were helpful, but it seems that the most equipment that the Ukrainian army was getting is being supplied to them by Russians, essentially leaving their tanks in the fields where Ukrainian farmers were picking them up and delivering them to Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian, or where they were like, you know, they'd lose a battle and just leave lots of stuff, and Ukrainians just pick it up and use it against them. So yeah, the biggest supply, the biggest help to Ukrainian army is the Russian army. So dear Russians, thank you very much. Just give up to Ukrainian forces and stop fighting. There's no point for you to die. Just give us a bit more tanks. We won't mind. I think I'll tell it for every Ukrainian that has at least half a brain in his head. But the fighting have stopped along those lines here. There's some fighting going on at the moment around here, but there's a natural defense line, so there's a river. There is a talk about Ukrainians crossing the river in Kupiansk and taking this area, but despite what people wanted, despite what happens, at the moment Ukrainians have slowed down. They're doing things they're supposed to do, but they slowed down to pull up the supply lines. Because yes, the Western HIMARS systems did help them to pull back Russian supply lines, but obviously if they want to move and capture, for example, I think the next step in here would be capturing down this road towards Severodonetsk, just if they're already here. But to do that, they need to have their supplies, and obviously not to end up in the same situations that Russian ended up in around here, where they captured this territory and now they simply don't have where to run because they die. So Ukrainians are trying to set up the situation where they can do other things and break through the Russian lines without being in the situation where they actually all end up in great danger, right? There are also problems of obviously Russian border here. All the Ukrainians kind of say, look, we don't want to cross our borders, and any explosions on the Russian territory is usually you guys smoking in the wrong place, or essentially just was a case where the Russian, they had the guys who to man the new guys to man the missiles, and they shot the missiles towards Moscow over Kiev. So they were like, yeah, this is Kiev, this is Moscow, right? We're right in between, so how about the rockets fly the other direction? No idea why they did it, but there is a talk about this. But essentially what we're talking is the quality of the troops of Russians have fallen, right? Because they've been like, they too far stretched out, and if Ukrainians over time are training up their troops and building up and making sure that like they don't lose as many troops, as well as British helping to train Ukrainian troops and properly trained troops coming in, Russian quality of the troops is falling. Now, one more thing I wanted to talk about before I finish is, despite what I'm saying here, that the troops are falling and they're struggling at the moment, there is a very, very, very big thing. This has already happened, and it's happening, and the knock-on effect of that is gonna be visible in the next couple of months, I guess, right? And this is why I say that I actually say that, despite what some people say that, hey, Ukrainians should just go and wipe Russians off, actually very, very kind of on the side of Ukrainian military command, who says, look, you know, we have to build up, and once we build up and reach certain extent, right, we can do the next steps, right? Because in the next couple of months, we will see that the numbers of Russian troops are rising, right? And why is this happening? It's kind of simple. For the same reasons they could actually hire more and more troops from the like impoverished towns in Russia. Is I once made a video in Russian, I think I've done it in English as well, as why the support was so high for the war in Ukraine, and saying that look, there's a lot of impoverished regions in Russia, they're not making that much money, and for them that war was like, you know, something we kind of, they were celebrating because they were showing how great they are, and the fact that they live like shit kind of somehow means that, you know, the greatness of their country. But in the last few months, not in the last few months, but since April, May, many Western companies have left Russia, right? So we're talking IKEA, we're talking car manufacturing, we're talking a bunch of other things, like, and those are the companies that were paying people wages in somewhere like Voronezh, Saratov, Volgograd, you know, like, so they would have like there was like car manufacturing in Saratov, for example. People would be being paid there like reasonably good wages, like if the normal wage in Russia was like 17,000 rubles, which is like $200-300 a month, like, you know, then these guys were getting like $1,500 a month. You know, but these companies leaving these areas also meant that, for example, once IKEA left Russia, not only did they close their factories, right, but they have also closed their shops. When the car manufacturers left, many centers that were selling those cars are closing down. So lots and lots and lots of people lost their jobs. And we're talking like, you know, the knock-on effect is to up to a few million people will have lost or will lose their jobs in the near future, because as the companies were leaving Russia, they continued paying wages all the way until the end of August for like 3 months. And now that thing has run out. So essentially from end of August and further on, many of those people will not have the money. They will probably signed up to get some assistance from the government, unemployment, but it's not very much. Essentially, if you have a family and you all lost your jobs, the government assistance is next to non-existent. So when the Russian recruiters are going to come to those towns, many men will feel that, yeah, this is the only choice they have, because the sign-up bonus, so if you only sign up, you get like 200,000 rubles, which is, if you understand, is like somebody whose income just went from like a couple of $1,000, which is from like $1,000, which is like, okay, cool, you know, to went all the way down to like $200, and he's got a family, a wife and a couple of kids, and he needs to support them. Like, many of these places, like, these guys will feel that, yeah, they don't have a choice, right? You know, some people will be able to last longer, but some people who were not getting those wages but were still surviving from the benefits that something like this comes in. So if you have like a factory which essentially generates like 2,000 middle class people, those 2,000 middle class people obviously bring the prosperity to about another 20,000 people in that town. They don't live as well, but they work in the cafeteria, like, you know, they have a little like bar or restaurant where people can go have drinks. And now that money stream has dried out, and many of those places will close down. People will lose their jobs, and they will not have new places to go to work for, because essentially that couple of production factories which were owned by Ford or Toyota or whoever, by Siemens or someone like this, they closed down, and those people, this money is not going down the line of like, yeah, they're not spending that money. There is no more like of those, I don't know, the core 5-10,000 people in the city, over a million, let's say, that will share out the economy. Obviously, there still are the things, but there's a big loss in income, a big loss in revenue for many people who live in these areas, which is, and the knock-on effect is that in the next months or two, many of those people are going to start falling below poverty lines, and I suspect many guys will be very tempted by signing a contract either with the Russian military or with some of those privateer companies that exist in Russia and hire people in Russia. And the fact of life is that the people who do have professional military training, who can be used inside, like, you know, as proper military, most likely many of them will not actually make it to Ukraine, because many of those people are already getting ready for Russia going to shit after they lose that war. But many are not very well trained people who do not have like good training, or do not have the speciality, like, you know, any training, whether they're like a proper tank driver, or whether they're like proper IT person, or whether they're like very good at like something they do in military. Like, those unprofessional people will be used as a cannon fodder in Ukraine, right? And they will be coming there, and they will be sent to Ukraine. They will be given a shitty equipment. We already talked about this, that they used very old T-62 tanks, which are like essentially an original T-62 tank, all the way from 1962, right, in Ukraine. And they'll be given equipment like this, very old equipment, which is just hardly restored, right? It's not going to be new equipment, but a T-62 is still a T-62, and you still need to destroy it, and it still has got a cannon with like 120 millimeters or something like this, and maybe it cannot compete with the Ukrainian tank, with one Ukrainian tank, but if somebody is given 5 of those, then they can still do damage, and they can still act as an aggressor on Ukrainian territory. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen, right? So today we have covered essentially part of the situation which comes to people, right? And how the lack of people obviously led to Russians losing this territory. And we see, like I say, what we've seen in Russia at the moment, like I say, conscripting the prisoners from the jails, bringing in people who are not trained, essentially as cannon fodder, to just continue attacking. And all this is essentially, like I said, there's 3 forces in this war, which is Ukrainians, Russians, and, to be honest, Russian government, right? And the Russian government seems to be intent. If you look, I was saying that, look, you know, the Russians were gonna planning to lose at least 20-30,000 in Ukraine before they get out. Well, now whatever happened in the south allowed them to start losing a lot more. And what I see is essentially the old generation of who don't want to leave the places they're in, essentially trying to destroy the younger generation, the people who would be willing to fight the older generation, the old guard, and trying to get the Russian people to kind of say, yes, we cannot survive without the government that sits in the Moscow. Essentially, that is an attempt to pacify Russia by burning as many people as they can in Ukraine, right? They use their means to get Russians to believe, to raise that hatred level, and now they trying to use those propaganda means they have, and the money, because obviously they understand that Russian rubles, they're essentially just paper, right? And but by giving the Russian rubles, they trying to steal as much as they can in currency for themselves. But obviously for the somebody who lives in the village, let's say, right, Kluchi in, what is it, Saratov region, which is like a small village in the middle of nowhere, right? Or I don't know, was it Pryachina? Yeah, in the village Pryachina, right? For whom 200 rubles seems like a big sum of money, something that just for signing up, imagine that, just for signing up, he will get more money than he probably gets in the next, I don't know, 2 years, right? And doesn't have any other wage to support his family because other sources of incomes have died out, because there's no money come, because all the big enterprises closed down in Saratov and what is it, Engels, yeah, they closed down all those factories, so there's less money coming down from people buying the vegetables he was growing somewhere or whatever he was doing. And it's like now less people paying him the money, right? The possibility for these guys to go and just die in Ukraine, because he will hope that he will survive, right? He'll most likely die, but he will most likely get thrown into the part where he is, like, you know, most likely to die, because they will try to keep at least some of the professional soldiers back in Russia, because they understand they will lose, right? They already do understand that, and they're essentially getting ready for the war inside the Russia. But they are trying to get rid of as many capable people as they have. So it's like this was the last attempt to keep the government, but we already see what happens, that the Chechnya, they're building up their own forces, many kind of local army units, which are official army, but they have hired lots of people, but those people that have any sort of military training, they're not being sent over, so it's only the cannon for the people which are being set up. So we don't know what's going to happen. Most likely the Russia is going to go all to shit, and I did mention that in my first video. I said, look, as soon as Russia loses this war, Ukrainians are probably going to end up having to accept Russian refugees. That's how bad things are in there, okay? But we're gonna wait and see, and at the moment what we see is that the amount of troops they have at the moment is not really sufficient to continue causing trouble to Ukraine, especially that Ukraine now has an ability, thanks to the Western help, obviously, to hit the targets which are deeper inside the Russian defense lines, and to hit the targets further than Russian artillery can. So essentially the difference of 2 kilometers is a difference of 2 kilometers, right? Difference of 20 kilometers, well, that's essentially like, you know, making sure that the Russians cannot defend their front lines, and they don't have enough people. So that's the situation as it stands. I hope I cleared it up a bit more without the like hooray we won, or like oh my god we've all been betrayed, we're all gonna die, right? If you like it, do put a like in the video, right? Maybe subscribe to the channel, I'll be very grateful. But also, like I said, there's channels that I spoke about. Check those guys out. They're more professional YouTubers, and they will give you some more interesting information, and you're probably not gonna fall asleep listening to them. So, alright guys, thank you very much for your time. I hope you do well. I hope I'm wrong about some things, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about the others. And I hope everything's gonna come peaceful and things are gonna change to the best for all of us. Thank you very much. Goodbye.